Dr. Patricia Sullivan worked as a county coroner in Lexington, Kentucky, for 31 years before the exhumation in March 2011 taught her that medical mistakes don't stay buried. They come back up with the bodies, written in bent nails and shredded fingertips, and faces frozen in expressions that the dead shouldn't be able to make. She'd performed over 3,000 autopsies, had examined bodies in every condition, had seen death in all its forms, but she'd never seen proof of the nightmare everyone fears. Never seen evidence that someone had woken up in their coffin, never seen a face that told her, beyond any doubt, that this man had died twice. Once when the doctor said he was dead, and once when he actually was. I met Dr. Sullivan at a medical conference in Louisville in September 2024. She'd retired 3 years earlier, but still lectured occasionally on forensic pathology. She'd agreed to discuss the exhumation after I'd assured her the criminal case was closed, the appeals exhausted, the family had given permission. We sat in a quiet conference room after her lecture, and she told me about the day they dug up Marcus Boon, about what they found 6 feet down, about the evidence that should never exist. Marcus Boon died on February 7, 2010, Dr. Sullivan said, her hands flat on the table. At least that's what the death certificate said. He was 49 years old, type 1 diabetic, found unresponsive in his home by his brother. Paramedics called, pronounced dead at the scene by the attending physician. Marcus had lived alone in a small house outside Lexington. He'd been diabetic since childhood, managed it with insulin and diet. His brother Dennis Boon checked on him regularly. On February 7th, Dennis had stopped by and found Marcus unconscious on the floor. No pulse, no breathing, skin cold. Dennis called 911. The responding physician was Dr. Andrew Garrison, Dr. Sullivan said. Young doctor recently completed his residency. He examined Marcus at the scene, checked for vital signs, found none, pronounced him dead. Time of death, 11:47 a.m. The standard protocol in Kentucky for deaths outside hospitals required the body be examined by the county coroner if there were any questions. But Dr. Garrison had been confident. Natural death, diabetic, with known health issues. No signs of trauma, no reason for suspicion. He'd signed the death certificate, cause of death. Diabetic ketoacidosis. Marcus's funeral was February 10th, Dr. Sullivan said. 3 days later, his brother Dennis arranged everything. Small service, burial at Bluegrass Memorial Gardens. Marcus was placed in a standard casket, sealed, and buried. Everything normal, everything proper. 13 months later, Dr. Sullivan received a call from the Kentucky State Police. They were investigating Marcus Boon's death. New evidence had emerged. They suspected foul play. They needed an exhumation and full forensic autopsy. The investigation centered on Marcus's ex-wife, Carol Boon, Dr. Sullivan said. They'd divorced 2 years before his death. Bitter divorce. Custody battle over their teenage daughter. Carol stood to inherit Marcus's life insurance, $200,000, if their daughter was in her custody when Marcus died. Police had discovered that Carol had visited Marcus the night before he died. Neighbors had seen her car. There'd been an argument. And Carol had a history. A previous boyfriend had died under suspicious circumstances years earlier. Never charged, but investigated. Now police were looking at Marcus's death differently. March 23, 2011, Dr. Sullivan said. That's when we did the exhumation. I was there with 2 detectives, a forensic team, and the cemetery superintendent. We'd obtained all the proper court orders. Dennis Boon was present. He wanted to know the truth. The crew at Bluegrass Memorial had located Marcus's grave without difficulty. Plot 127, Section G. They'd begun excavation at dawn. By 9 a.m., they'd reached the burial vault, pulled it up, set it on the grass beside the grave. We opened the vault, Dr. Sullivan said, and immediately, I knew something was wrong. The casket inside wasn't positioned the way it should have been. It was tilted, rotated, not lying flat and level as it should be in an undisturbed vault. The casket had moved. At first, I thought maybe the vault had shifted, Dr. Sullivan said. Ground settling, water intrusion, something mechanical. But when we lifted the casket out, we saw it was worse than that. The casket had rotated 180 degrees. It was upside down. Complete inversion. The bottom of the casket was facing up. The top, the side with the lid, was facing down. The casket had somehow flipped inside the vault. Dennis Boone said, "How did that happen?" Dr. Sullivan said, and nobody had an answer. Caskets don't flip themselves. They're heavy. This one was steel, probably 400 pounds with the body. There's no mechanism that would cause a casket to invert inside a sealed vault. They'd transported the casket, still inverted, to the medical examiner's facility, set it carefully on the examination table. Dr. Sullivan and her assistant had examined the exterior carefully. The casket showed significant damage. Scratches. The finish was scraped in multiple places. Then we righted the casket, Dr. Sullivan said, carefully turned it over so it was positioned normally, and we prepared to open it. Dr. Sullivan had opened thousands of caskets for forensic examination, knew what to expect at various stages of decomposition. Marcus had been buried for 13 months. In Kentucky climate, in a sealed steel casket, she expected moderate decomposition. Bones would be visible, soft tissue would be significantly degraded, but structural form would remain. "I broke the seal," Dr. Sullivan said quietly, and the smell was immediate. Not just decomposition, something else. Something that made my assistant step back. They'd lifted the lid, and what Dr. Sullivan saw made her understand why the casket had been upside down. The interior was destroyed, Dr. Sullivan said. The satin lining was torn to shreds, completely shredded, and the lid, the inside of the lid, was damaged. The padding was ripped away. The metal underneath showed impact marks, dents, and the nails. The casket lid had decorative nails around the inner perimeter, small brass nails that held the satin lining in place. Those nails were bent, not pushed in. Bent outward, like something had been pushing from inside, like force had been applied from below, bending the nails up and out. Then I looked at Marcus, Dr. Sullivan said, her voice barely audible, and I saw his face. Decomposition had occurred. 13 months of normal post-mortem changes, but the facial structure was still identifiable, still showed expression, and that expression was terror, absolute terror. His mouth was open, Dr. Sullivan said. Wide open, jaw dislocated, like he'd been screaming. His eyes, the sockets showed evidence his eyes had been open, and his position. His body was twisted, contorted, not lying peacefully on his back, the way he'd been positioned at burial. He was on his side, arms up, hands near his face. Dr. Sullivan had examined the hands immediately. Both hands showed extreme damage. The fingertips were shredded, tissue destroyed, bone exposed, and under what remained of the tissue splinters, wood and fabric fragments, the same material from the casket lining and lid. He'd clawed at the lid, Dr. Sullivan said. Clawed until his fingertips were destroyed, until bone was exposed, until he couldn't claw anymore. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Boon had been alive when they buried him, had woken up in that casket, had realized where he was, had tried desperately to escape, had clawed and pushed and fought until the casket flipped, probably from his thrashing, probably from the force of his movement in the confined space, had continued fighting until he'd run out of air, until he'd suffocated, until he'd actually died. "I've never felt so sick performing an autopsy," Dr. Sullivan said. "Never felt so horrified by what I was seeing. Because this was preventable. This was a mistake. Marcus Boon wasn't murdered. He was buried alive because a doctor made a mistake." Dr. Sullivan had performed the full autopsy, found no evidence of poisoning, no evidence of foul play. Carol Boone hadn't killed Marcus. But Dr. Sullivan had found something else. Evidence of what had actually happened. Marcus showed signs of severe diabetic ketoacidosis, Dr. Sullivan said. His organs showed the damage pattern, and more importantly, I found evidence he'd been in a diabetic coma when he was pronounced dead. Diabetic coma can mimic death. Breathing becomes so shallow, it's undetectable without proper equipment. Heart rate drops to nearly nothing. Body temperature plummets. Blood pressure becomes unmeasurable. To an inexperienced observer, even a doctor who doesn't check carefully, the patient appears dead. Dr. Garrison had been negligent. Dr. Sullivan said he'd made a cursory examination, hadn't used proper diagnostic equipment, hadn't checked thoroughly. He'd been overconfident, and he'd pronounced a living man dead. The investigation expanded. Police reviewed Dr. Garrison's credentials, his training, his history, found that he'd been fast-tracked through medical school, had barely passed his licensing exams, had been flagged during his residency for cutting corners, but he'd been licensed, had been working, had been making life and death decisions. The horror is that Marcus probably woke up hours after burial, Dr. Sullivan said. Diabetic comas can last hours, sometimes days. He was buried at noon on February 10th. If he woke up that evening, he'd have been underground for 6, 8, maybe 10 hours before regaining consciousness. Woke up in darkness, in a sealed casket, 6 feet under, and tried to get out. Dr. Sullivan had estimated the time Marcus survived after waking, based on the oxygen capacity of the casket, based on the extent of his injuries, based on the evidence of his struggle. She estimated between 2 and 4 hours, 2 to 4 hours of consciousness in that coffin, knowing he was buried, fighting to survive. The casket had flipped because of his thrashing, Dr. Sullivan said. He'd been violent in his movements, desperate. The casket had rocked, had shifted, had eventually inverted, which meant he'd spent part of his conscious time upside down, disoriented, trapped, still fighting. Dr. Garrison was charged with negligent homicide. The trial was brief. Dr. Sullivan's testimony was definitive. The physical evidence was undeniable. Dr. Garrison was convicted in November 2011, sentenced to 15 years in prison, lost his medical license permanently. But that doesn't bring Marcus back, Dr. Sullivan said. Doesn't undo what happened to him. Doesn't erase those final hours of terror. Dennis Boon had been destroyed by the revelation. His brother hadn't died peacefully of natural causes. He died screaming in a coffin. Dennis had been present at the burial, had watched them lower the casket, had thrown dirt on the grave, had no idea Marcus was alive inside. Dennis sued the cemetery, the funeral home, Dr. Garrison, the hospital, Dr. Sullivan said. Won every case, settled, for millions. But money doesn't fix this. Nothing fixes this. Dr. Sullivan had recommended changes to Kentucky death verification protocols after the case. Mandatory waiting periods before burial, required use of diagnostic equipment, multiple physician verification for deaths outside hospitals. Some were adopted, others were deemed too expensive or impractical. I testified before the state medical board, Dr. Sullivan said, showed them the photographs. The bent nails, the shredded fingertips, the expression of terror, told them this is what happens when protocols aren't followed. When doctors are careless, when we assume death without verifying it, absolutely. The case had haunted Dr. Sullivan for years. She'd taken a leave of absence after the autopsy, seen a therapist, struggled with nightmares. How many times had she signed death certificates? How many bodies had she examined? Had she ever made a mistake? Had she ever pronounced someone dead who wasn't? I became obsessive about verification, Dr. Sullivan said. Started using equipment I'd never used before. Started doing tests I'd considered unnecessary, because I never wanted to make Dr. Garrison's mistake. Never wanted to be responsible for someone being buried alive. So Dr. Sullivan had kept the photographs from Marcus Boon's autopsy, used them in her lectures, showed them to medical students, explained what happens when you don't follow protocol, when you cut corners, when you assume. Those bent nails, Dr. Sullivan said. That's what I show them. Those nails were bent by a living human being pushing against them, trying to get out, trying to survive. That's not decomposition. That's not post-mortem movement. That's evidence of life, evidence of consciousness, evidence of terror. She pulled out her laptop, opened a folder, showed me the photographs, the casket interior, destroyed, the bent nails, the shredded fingertips, and Marcus's face, the expression preserved enough to see the terror. This is what medical negligence looks like. Dr. Sullivan said, this is what happens when doctors don't verify death properly. This is what happens when we fail our patients. And Dr. Sullivan had stayed in contact with Marcus Boon over the years. He'd never recovered emotionally, had moved away from Kentucky, changed careers, tried to rebuild his life, but he'd never forgotten, never stopped blaming himself for not questioning the death certificate, for not demanding more verification. Dennis told me something years later, Dr. Sullivan said. He said on the day of the funeral, when they were closing the casket, he thought he saw Marcus's eyelid twitch, just a tiny movement. But everyone told him it was his imagination, told him it was grief, told him the dead sometimes seemed to move, so he didn't say anything, didn't delay the funeral, and his brother was buried alive. That detail haunted Dr. Sullivan as much as the evidence. The possibility that if Dennis had spoken up, if he'd insisted on more examination, if someone had listened, Marcus might have been saved. You want to know what I believe? Dr. Sullivan said. I believe death verification protocols exist for a reason. I believe multiple checks and diagnostic equipment and waiting periods are necessary because the human body can fool us, because doctors make mistakes, because what looks like death sometimes isn't. She closed her laptop, put it away. And I believe Marcus Boon's death, his real death, his second death, his death by suffocation in a sealed casket, should never be forgotten, because he is proof that our worst nightmare is real. That being buried alive isn't just a horror story, that it can happen, that it has happened, that without proper protocols, it will happen again. Dr. Patricia Sullivan left the conference that afternoon, heading back to her retirement, where she didn't have to examine bodies anymore, didn't have to sign death certificates, didn't have to carry the weight of verification. And I sat there thinking about Marcus Boon, about a man who woke up in his coffin, who clawed until his fingertips were gone, who pushed so hard against the lid that he bent metal nails, who fought so desperately that he flipped a 400-pound casket upside down, who died screaming in darkness, 6 feet underground, because a doctor didn't check carefully enough. The rational explanation is medical error. Diabetic coma misdiagnosed as death. Negligence, inadequate examination. All true, all documented, all proven in court. But that doesn't make it less horrifying. Doesn't make those bent nails less real. Doesn't make Marcus's terror less absolute. Maybe every death should be verified twice. Maybe every body should wait longer before burial. Maybe every doctor should see those photographs of Marcus Boon's fingertips. See the bent nails. See the destroyed casket lining. See the face frozen in terror. And remember, that death isn't always what it seems. That the body can fool even trained physicians. That what looks like death might be coma, might be suspended animation, might be something that wears off hours after burial. And when it does, when consciousness returns, when someone wakes up in a sealed casket 6 feet underground, they fight, they claw, they push, they bend metal nails with bare hands, they flip 400-pound caskets, they scream until the air runs out, and they die knowing exactly where they are, knowing they're buried, knowing no one can hear them, knowing they're going to suffocate. That's what the bent nails tell us. That's what the shredded fingertips prove. That Marcus Boon died twice, and the second time, he knew it was happening. Dr. Ramon Santos worked as a forensic pathologist in Manila for 19 years. Before the exhumation in June 2012 showed him something that medical science couldn't explain. He'd examined over 2,000 bodies, had seen every stage of decomposition, had documented the predictable progression of death and decay, but he'd never seen a body that refused to follow the rules. Never touched skin that shouldn't be soft, never felt warmth where there should only be cold. The case of Sophia Reyes, the 3-year-old girl they called the sleeping angel, the child who'd been dead for 2 years but looked like she'd died yesterday, and felt, when Dr. Santos touched her hand, impossibly warm. I met Dr. Santos at his office in Quezon City in August 2024. He'd been reluctant to discuss the case publicly, had declined interviews for years, but he'd agreed to talk now because, he said, there are things medicine can't explain, and pretending otherwise is dishonest. We sat in his consultation room, air conditioning humming against Manila's heat, and he told me about the day they opened Sophia's grave, about what they found, about what he felt. Sophia Reyes died on May 3, 2010, Dr. Santos said, his hands folded on his desk. She was 3 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She'd been sick for 8 months. Her family had done everything, chemotherapy, hospital stays, everything they could afford. But the cancer was aggressive. Sophia died in her sleep at home, in her mother's arms. Sophia's family lived in Taguig, a district in Metro Manila, working-class family. The father, Eduardo, worked construction. The mother, Maria, stayed home with their 3 children. Sophia was the youngest. When she died, the family had scraped together everything they had for a proper funeral. The funeral was May 6, 2010, Dr. Santos said. 3 days after her death, traditional Catholic service, Sophia was buried at Manila Memorial Park. Her family visited her grave every week for 2 years, brought flowers, prayed, maintained the gravesite. In April 2012, 2 years after Sophia's death, the cemetery management contacted the Reyes family. There was a problem with the cemetery section where Sophia was buried, ground instability. Several graves needed to be relocated to a different section. The cemetery would handle everything, but the family needed to give permission. The Reyes family agreed, Dr. Santos said. But Maria, Sophia's mother, had a request. She wanted to see her daughter one more time, wanted the casket opened before reburial. The cemetery initially refused, said it wasn't advisable, said after 2 years the body wouldn't be viewable. But Maria insisted, and eventually they agreed. The cemetery had contacted Dr. Santos because they needed a medical professional present for the exhumation and opening. Standard procedure when families requested to view remains after extended burial. Dr. Santos had agreed. He'd handled many such cases, knew what to expect. June 8, 2012, Dr. Santos said. That's when we did the exhumation, morning around 8 a.m. The cemetery crew had prepared everything. I was there with Maria and Eduardo Reyes, their parish priest, Father Miguel Cruz, and several cemetery staff members. The excavation had been routine. Sophia's grave was in the old section, ground-level burial, no vault, just the casket in the earth. The crew had dug carefully, reached the casket by 9 a.m. It was a small white casket, child-sized, showing 2 years of ground contact, but structurally intact. We lifted it out, Dr. Santos said. Set it carefully on the grass under a tent we'd erected for privacy, and I examined it before opening. The casket had been sealed, not professionally, but adequately. There was soil compacted around the seal, no evidence of water intrusion or disturbance. Dr. Santos had explained to Maria and Eduardo what they should expect. After 2 years in Manila's tropical climate, in ground burial with no vault, Sophia's body would be significantly decomposed, possibly skeletal, certainly not recognizable. He'd wanted to prepare them, wanted to prevent trauma. But Maria insisted she needed to see. Dr. Santos said she needed to say goodbye properly, so I prepared to open the casket. Dr. Santos had broken the seal carefully, expected the immediate smell of decomposition, expected to see advanced decay, expected what he'd seen dozens of times before in 2-year-old burials. I lifted the lid, Dr. Santos said, quietly, and there was no smell, no odor of decomposition, just nothing, like opening an empty box. Inside the casket was Sophia, wearing the white dress she'd been buried in, hands folded on her chest, eyes closed, and completely, impossibly preserved. She looked like she was sleeping, Dr. Santos said. Her skin was intact, not discolored, not showing any signs of decay. Her face was peaceful. Her hair was still in place. Her eyelashes were intact, delicate, visible, like she'd just closed her eyes. Maria had gasped. Eduardo had crossed himself. Father Cruz had begun praying, and Dr. Santos had stood there, staring, trying to process what he was seeing. What shouldn't be possible. I checked the casket interior, Dr. Santos said. Looked for evidence of unusual preservation conditions. Some caskets create microenvironments that can slow decay, airtight seals, chemical interactions, particular conditions, but this casket was standard. Wood, simple construction, not designed for preservation. Dr. Santos had examined Sophia more closely. Her dress was clean, no staining from decomposition fluids. Her skin showed no mummification, no saponification, the waxy transformation that sometimes occurs in bodies buried in certain soils. She looked fresh, recent, like she'd been prepared yesterday. I told everyone I needed to examine her, Dr. Santos said. Needed to verify this was actually Sophia Reyes. Needed to understand what I was seeing. Maria gave permission. And I touched her. Dr. Santos had placed his hand on Sophia's hand. The small 3-year-old hand, and what he felt made him pull back involuntarily. Warmth, Dr. Santos said. Her hand was warm, not body temperature, but warm. Warmer than the ambient air. Warmer than the casket wood. Warm. Dr. Santos had checked his own hand. Wondered if he'd imagined it. Touched Sophia's hand again. Same sensation. Definite warmth. Not hot, but noticeably warm. Room temperature would be around 28 degrees Celsius in Manila's morning heat. Sophia's hand felt closer to 32-33 degrees. Body temperature is 37 degrees. Sophia's hand was somewhere in between. I checked for signs of life, Dr. Santos said. I know that sounds absurd. Sophia had been dead for 2 years, but I checked anyway. No pulse, no breathing, no response to stimuli. She was dead, had been dead, but her body was warm and perfectly preserved. Dr. Santos had examined her carefully, checked her skin elasticity, checked her joints. Bodies in advanced decomposition are rigid, desiccated. Sophia's body had normal flexibility. Her skin had normal texture. Not fresh, there was a quality to it that indicated death, but not decayed. I performed a minimal examination, Dr. Santos said. Documented everything. Took photographs, measured temperature, and I had no explanation. This violated everything I knew about post-mortem decomposition. The news spread quickly. Within hours, people were gathering at the cemetery. Word had gotten out about the perfectly preserved child, about the sleeping angel. By afternoon, there were hundreds of people trying to see Sophia. The cemetery had to close the area, called security. The Catholic Church got involved, Dr. Santos said. Father Cruz had reported what he'd seen. The archdiocese sent representatives. They examined Sophia, documented her condition, and they began investigating for possible sainthood. Incorruptibility, the failure of a body to decay, is considered a sign of holiness in Catholic tradition. Scientists arrived too. A team from the University of the Philippines, soil experts, microbiologists, forensic specialists. They took samples from the grave site, analyzed the soil, tested for chemical composition, looked for anything that might explain preservation. The soil was ordinary, Dr. Santos said. Slightly acidic, well-drained, nothing special, no chemicals, no unusual mineral content, nothing that would preserve a body. In fact, the conditions were ideal for decomposition. Warm, tropical, moist, Sophia should have decomposed rapidly. The casket was examined by materials scientists. Standard wood construction. No special treatments. No sealants that would create preservation conditions. The casket had some water damage, some deterioration. It hadn't been airtight. Air had circulated. Sophia had been in contact with the natural decomposition environment, but she hadn't decomposed. The scientific team published their findings 6 months later, Dr. Santos said. Conclusion: unexplained preservation due to unknown factors. They couldn't explain it. They documented everything: the soil, the casket, the body condition. But they couldn't provide a mechanism, couldn't say why Sophia hadn't decayed. The archdiocese had taken a different approach. They'd interviewed Sophia's family, documented her short life, collected testimony from people who'd known her, and they'd found something interesting. Sophia had been described as unusually peaceful, Dr. Santos said, even while dying, even in pain. She'd comforted her mother, told Maria not to cry, told her she was going somewhere beautiful, 3 years old, dying of cancer, and she'd been comforting the adults around her. The archdiocese had opened an investigation for beatification, the first step towards sainthood. The investigation continued for 2 years. Ultimately, it stalled. Lack of documented miracles. Lack of sufficient evidence of heroic virtue. But Sophia's body remained preserved. Maria had Sophia reburied in a new plot, Dr. Santos said. Requested a above-ground crypt with a viewing window. The archdiocese approved it. And for years, people visited. Thousands of people. Coming to see the sleeping angel. Coming to pray. Coming to witness. Dr. Santos had visited Sophia's crypt several times over the following years. Had examined her condition periodically with permission, and she'd remained unchanged. Year after year, no decay, no deterioration, her body maintaining that same peaceful sleeping appearance. But the warmth faded, Dr. Santos said. When I examined her a year later, her body had cooled to ambient temperature, normal for a deceased body. Whatever had caused the warmth I'd felt that first day, it was gone. The scientific community had tried to dismiss the case, called it measurement error, called Dr. Santos's warmth sensation subjective, suggested the preservation was natural, but unusual, a combination of factors that created perfect conditions. They insisted there was a rational explanation, even if they couldn't identify it. But I know what I felt, Dr. Santos said. I'm a forensic pathologist. I've touched thousands of dead bodies. I know what room temperature feels like. I know what body temperature feels like. Sophia's hand was warm. Not imagination, not suggestion. Measurably, noticeably warm. Dr. Santos had struggled with the case for years. It challenged everything he'd been taught, everything he believed about death and decomposition. He'd considered every possible explanation, and none fit. I researched incorruptible saints, Dr. Santos said. Found dozens of documented cases throughout history, bodies that didn't decay, that remained preserved for decades, centuries. The Catholic Church accepts it as miraculous. Science calls it unexplained or fraudulent, but it's documented, photographed, examined by skeptical observers, and Sophia fit the pattern. Sophia Reyes's body remained preserved for 7 years after exhumation. Then, in 2019, decomposition finally began. Slowly, gradually, her skin began to darken. Her features began to change. By 2021, she looked like a body that had been dead for 11 years should look. The preservation had ended. The archdiocese documented the decomposition, Dr. Santos said. Filmed it. Studied it, and they couldn't explain why it started when it did. Why 7 years after exhumation? Why not immediately? Why not never? Just, it started. And within 2 years, Sophia looked like every other body buried for a decade. Dr. Santos had examined her one final time in 2022, found advanced decomposition. Normal decay, nothing unusual. Sophia had finally followed the biological rules that every other body follows. But that doesn't explain the 7 years, Dr. Santos said. Doesn't explain the warmth. Doesn't explain why a 3-year-old girl buried in tropical soil without special preservation techniques remained perfectly intact for 7 years, while science said it was impossible. Dr. Santos had kept his own documentation, photographs from 2012 showing Sophia looking freshly deceased, photographs from each year showing no change, then photographs from 2019 showing decomposition beginning and his temperature measurements. 32 degrees Celsius on Sophia's hand in June 2012, ambient temperature by June 2013. I've lectured on this case, Dr. Santos said, shown the photographs, explained the conditions, and I always get the same questions. Was it a hoax? Was the body somehow preserved artificially? Was I mistaken? And my answer is always the same. No, no hoax. No preservation techniques. No mistake. This was real. This happened. And I don't know why. He stood up, walked to his window overlooking Quezon City. Outside, Manila traffic crawled past. Normal life. Normal world. Normal rules of physics and biology. You want to know what I believe? Dr. Santos said. I believe Sophia Reyes was special. I believe something about her death, about her spirit, about whatever it is that makes us human. It stayed. It protected her body. It kept her from decaying for 7 years. And then, when whatever process was happening completed, it let go, and decomposition proceeded normally. He turned back to face me. Science calls that magical thinking, Dr. Santos said. Says I'm projecting. Says I'm allowing emotion to override rational analysis. But I was there. I touched her. I measured her temperature. I examined her over years. And what I witnessed doesn't fit into scientific materialism. Doesn't fit into our understanding of death and decay. Dr. Ramon Santos walked me to the door of his office that afternoon, and I left, thinking about Sophia Reyes, about the sleeping angel, about a 3-year-old girl who died of cancer, but whose body refused to decay for 7 years, about a forensic pathologist who touched her hand and felt warmth that shouldn't exist. The rational explanation is that there isn't one. Science documented the case, examined the evidence, and concluded, unexplained. Unknown factors. No mechanism identified. But Dr. Santos knows what he felt. Knows that warmth was real. Knows that Sophia's body violated every rule of decomposition for 7 years. And knows that sometimes, maybe the dead don't follow the rules we've written for them. Maybe Sophia Reyes stayed preserved because some part of her wasn't ready to let go. Maybe her spirit, her consciousness, whatever we want to call it, protected her body, kept her looking peaceful, kept her looking like she was sleeping, kept her warm, at least for a little while. Long enough for her mother to see her one more time. Long enough for thousands of people to witness something impossible. Long enough for science to document it, examine it, and admit it couldn't explain it. And then, when whatever needed to happen had happened, the preservation ended. And Sophia Reyes finally became what every dead body becomes. Dust returning to dust. But for 7 years, she was the sleeping angel. The child who wouldn't decay. The 3-year-old whose body stayed soft and warm and peaceful. Not because of chemicals or casket design or soil composition, but because of something else. Something science can't measure. Something that kept her body beautiful. Long after death should have claimed it. And when Dr. Ramon Santos touched her hand in June 2012 and felt warmth, that was real. That was evidence. That was proof that death sometimes makes exceptions for the innocent. for the peaceful, for the sleeping angels.